Our next speaker will be Mr. Dawes of the Canadian International Development Association. We're delighted to have you with us, Mr. Dawes, to talk about the Canadian sources of capital for low-cost housing.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to focus more particularly on the criteria which I think should be established for the development of human settlement programs, housing in particular. Mr. Helm has mentioned that Sweden allocates 1% of its GNP to developmental programs. Canada is presently up to the level of 0.5 of 1%, currently about $1 billion per year. This is official development assistance and does not include anything from the private sector, and the funds go into direct bilateral programs with developing countries as well as through the UN agencies, and some monies in support of the non-governmental organizations, in particular such as CUSO, the Canadian University Service Overseas, and another one, CESO, the Canadian Executive Service for Canada. The problem, as far as CEDA's program is concerned, is not really one of allocating resources. The money is certainly there. Statements are being made in the official conference across the bay to indicate that monies will be made available for human settlement programs. The problem, however, is to raise the level of people's consciousness, politically and otherwise, so that they themselves will see what has to be done within their own countries, so that they themselves can develop the kind of programs which reflect new priorities. There are four basic criteria which should be applied to human settlement programs to improve the quality of life. I think it's been very difficult to get the concept of human settlements across to most of us. Human settlements, improving the quality of life in human settlements has to do with improving the quality of life in the place where you and I live. It's a spatial concept. OECD, the Overseas Commission for Economic Development, measures economic growth in terms of gross national product. If I tell you that the gross national product of Bangladesh is somewhere under $100 per year, if you understand that to mean that the average person makes less than $100 per year, if we accept the fact that when we talk about averages, therefore there must be a large percentage of the population who are making an income much below $100 per year, $25, $30 per year, how can you conceive of improving the quality of life for people at that level unless you stop talking about averages in the GNP and you start talking about what is happening in their own communities? And when you talk about development in communities, you have to talk about, first of all, improvement in the quality and quantity of food available. You and I sit down per day and consume about 3,000 calories of food per day. People in the developing world are lucky to get 1,000. When I worked in Nigeria, I often saw people stampede food tables just to get the necessary food for a day's meal. So the second criteria must be to improve the quality of shelter. Dr. Nairi in Tanzania recently instigated a program of taking the thatched roofs off the mud village housing and putting on corrugated iron. Taking away the thatched roofs which house rodents and infestation. This is a major step forward for a country at that level of existence. If it's possible in the average African or Indian village to change a mud and dung floor to a concrete floor, this would be a major step upwards. It is not possible, and I think this conference is realizing this, it is not possible to transfer Western standards of space, Western standards of materials, Western standards of technology to the developing world. The conference across the water is definitely stating time and time again that housing standards, human settlement standards, must be appropriate to the countries and to the regions. And you have to start from where they are. Even in Canada and the United States, we have to do the same thing. We have to start with programs at a much lower standard if we're going to meet the housing requirements of the majority of our people. So the third criteria must be that there must be an improvement in the quality of public health. And Canada, in its public statement, has said that we must become involved in programs for the provision of potable water, improved public health programs, waste disposal programs, and so on. These basic service programs must be instigated if people's health are to be improved. It's hard for us to realize that in Africa and India, with bad water, people are ingesting all kinds of diseases which grow in their bodies and which consume even the majority of food that they do consume. And if they've got an hour or two of available labor, that is about all the energy they have got to improve or to produce the food that they need. And the fourth criteria must be to back programs of appropriate education. All of our aid programs, in all of our aid programs, certainly Canada, this is the case, we have supported educational programs in support of universities and advanced technical institutions, and very little has been done in the way of providing educational assistance for people at the lower levels. In northern Nigeria, in the northeastern state, a population of 3 or 4 million when I was there were 88,000 children in the public schools. There were only 4,000 students in the secondary schools and 104 students in university education. And that is likely more than they could afford. So here are your four criteria. There must be an improvement in the quality of food, an improvement in the quality of shelter, but appropriate. There must be an improvement in the provision of public health services, and there must be improvement in the provision of appropriate education. These are the four basic criteria, and you may as well establish those sort of a criteria before you start talking about the transference of financial resources. Mr. Kim has already referred to two of the basic kinds of programs which are necessary in the developing world: squatter settlement programs and sites and services programs. It should be stated very clearly, however, that these programs must be initiated by national governments. International aid agencies can only respond to requests for assistance. And it is not possible for countries such as Canada and the United States or Sweden to do anything in the way of assistance in human settlement programs, in squatter settlements, unless we're requested to do so. And it is not possible to do anything in the way of squatter settlements unless the local government gives security of land tenure to the people that are living there. If they say, we don't want you, if they threaten to bring the bulldozer in at some time, then those people will not have the basic interest to do anything about improving their quality of life. But if the government very simply gives security of land tenure to people living in these areas, they will expend a fantastic amount of energy in building their own homes out of the waste materials that they can find from the consumer society that lives all around them. Then if there is some security of land tenure, it's possible for developing agencies to come in and give assistance with provision of potable water, waste disposal systems, public health, and appropriate education. But these things have to be done at the local level first. The same applies to the sites and services kind of programs. These are cooperative programs, a tremendous amount of energy generated from within the community where people can help themselves. There just never will be enough money in the world to build all the housing that is required for the urban settlements of the world. Why are governments so concerned today about what is happening in the urban centers? Fantastic migrations of people from the rural areas where unemployment is sometimes as high as 50%. Into the major urban centers, and the politicians are worried, not necessarily because the standard of living is so low, but because the threat of revolution will overthrow their governments if they don't do something to improve the quality of life in these areas. And this is what we have to realize. We can have all the do-gooder programs that we want through our agencies or through the NGO programs, but the hard fact of the matter is that action is going to be taken when it becomes politically expedient to do so. And this means pressure from people. And this is the significance of the forum that we have here today. There are two kinds of programs which CETA, Canadian CETA, is involved in. Three kinds really, but I'll discuss two: multilateral programs and the bilateral program. Through the conference, the Canadian government is strongly supporting two specific programs. One was announced by the President of the University of British Columbia the other day, by President Kenny, when he indicated that the University of British Columbia has inaugurated the formation of a Human Settlement Centre. And as part of that centre, a audio-visual and information centre will be formed. This information centre will be formed to provide information throughout the world under contract with the United Nations, and the program will be supported by the provincial government of British Columbia and the federal government of Canada in cooperation with the United Nations. The second program which Canada would support is the formation of 6 regional training programs throughout the world. Regional training programs are made up of training institutes, information programs, and research and development programs. And obviously the objective of both of these programs is to train personnel. Academic personnel in particular tend not to discuss human settlement programs amongst themselves. They are involved in their own particular expertise. But these training programs, and the University of British Columbia for the first time in Canada will have a program training people in human settlement sciences. And I think this is a very, very significant development. So these are the two multilateral programs which are top on the agenda of the conference and of the Canadian government. As far as bilateral programs are concerned, I've already stated the criteria, the 4 criteria, and Canada will be hopefully responding to official requests from overseas governments for programs in pure water, waste disposal, public health, and appropriate education. But the emphasis must be on the necessity to develop national programs of action. Canada, United States, various other developed countries cannot respond to programs overseas unless the criteria is shifted from the current kind of programs having to do with increased transportation systems, hydroelectric programs, which very often only benefit the already well-to-do in the developing world. Increased productivity and consumption similar to the Western world. Most countries, including the developed world, have to shift their priorities to develop programs in support of the very poor. And this is something which requires a political will. And until that sort of will is expressed through development programs, then there is not very much that anyone else can do. I'm convinced that the money is there, both multilateral and bilateral. I'm convinced that it'll take some time before governments will shift their priorities in these new areas. Thank you very much.